The echoes of history often reach us through the remnants of stone walls, the dust of forgotten battlefields, and the whispers of stories long untold. Among these echoes, few chapters are as dramatic, as tumultuous, or as transformative as the Crusades. They were a series of conflicts that reshaped the medieval world, altering the political, religious, and cultural landscapes of Europe and the Near East in ways that still reverberate today. To truly understand the Crusades, one must look beyond the clash of swords and siege engines into the hopes, fears, and ambitions of the people who lived through these turbulent centuries. It was a time when faith and politics, devotion and ambition were inseparably intertwined, and where the notion of holy war became a defining concept of an entire era. Hello, and welcome to The Other Side Stories. Here, we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. The story of the Crusades begins not in the battlefields of Jerusalem, but in the courts and councils of Europe, where a complex web of power, faith, and rivalry had been steadily growing for centuries. By the late 11th century, the Christian kingdoms of Western Europe were experiencing both spiritual revival and mounting social pressures. The population was increasing, trade was expanding, and the influence of the Catholic Church was reaching into almost every aspect of daily life. But with this growth came tension. Noble families often competed fiercely for territory. The papacy sought to assert its authority over secular rulers, and countless knights and warriors hungered for honor and opportunity. Meanwhile, to the east, the Byzantine Empire, the once mighty successor to Rome, found itself under increasing threat from Muslim powers. The Seljuk Turks had advanced into Anatolia, capturing cities and threatening the very heart of Byzantium. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, facing the daunting task of defending his empire, turned to Western Europe for assistance. His pleas for aid would become the spark that ignited one of the most ambitious and far-reaching military campaigns of the Middle Ages. In 1095, Pope Urban II addressed the Council of Clermont with a speech that would resonate through the ages. He painted a vivid picture of Christian suffering in the Holy Land, of pilgrims harassed and holy sites desecrated, and he called upon the knights of Christendom to rise in defense of their faith. It was a call to arms, but it was more than just military strategy. It was a spiritual imperative. The Pope promised indulgences, forgiveness of sins, and eternal glory to those who answered the call. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of men from all walks of life, from noble knights to humble peasants, set out with a sense of purpose, bound by faith and the promise of divine reward. This first wave of crusaders, known later as the People's Crusade, was marked by enthusiasm but also by chaos. Many who set out were poorly equipped and unprepared for the harsh realities of travel and war in foreign lands. Led by charismatic figures such as Peter the Hermit, they traversed the European continent, gathering followers as they went, often creating disorder in the towns and regions they passed through. When they reached the Byzantine Empire, their numbers had swelled, but so too had their challenges. Disease, lack of supplies, and clashes with local populations weakened the army. And when they finally entered Anatolia, they faced the might of the Seljuk forces. The People's Crusade ended in tragedy, decimating those who had set out with zeal but little preparation. Yet this was only the beginning. The principal, or First Crusade, composed of organized and heavily armed contingents of knights and nobles, followed shortly after. It was led by a cadre of seasoned leaders, Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Toronto, and others, each bringing their own armies, ambitions, and strategies. Their journey from Europe to the Levant was arduous, spanning thousands of miles through unfamiliar lands, hostile territories, and harsh climates. Along the way, they fought battles against Muslim forces, navigated political alliances with local lords, and endured hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Despite these challenges, the First Crusade achieved what many had considered impossible. In 1099, after a grueling siege, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem. The city, sacred to Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike, became the crown jewel of their conquest. The victory was celebrated across Europe as a triumph of faith and divine favor. Yet the capture of Jerusalem was accompanied by brutality. Historical accounts describe massacres of the city's inhabitants, both Muslim and Jewish, a grim reminder of the human cost of such religious wars. In the aftermath of this victory, the Crusaders established a series of states in the Levant, collectively known as the Crusader States. These included the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These polities were feudal in nature, with European-style governance imposed upon a complex mosaic of local populations, including Muslims, Christians of different denominations, and Jews. The Crusader states were constantly under threat from surrounding powers, both Islamic and Byzantine, requiring ongoing military campaigns to defend and expand their territories. The success of the First Crusade inspired further campaigns. Subsequent crusades, numbering 8 major expeditions over nearly 2 centuries, sought to maintain, recover, or expand Christian control in the Holy Land. Each crusade had its own character, leaders, and outcomes. The Second Crusade, launched in response to the fall of the County of Edessa, ended in failure, revealing the difficulty of sustaining long-distance military campaigns and the complexities of coordination among European monarchs. The Third Crusade, led by figures such as Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I of the Holy Roman Empire, achieved notable victories but ultimately failed to recapture Jerusalem, highlighting the limitations of even the most determined and capable leaders. Throughout these campaigns, the Crusades left a profound mark on both Europe and the Islamic world. In Europe, they stimulated trade, strengthened the influence of the Church, and created new opportunities for nobles and merchants alike. They also fostered cultural exchange, as Crusaders encountered the rich civilizations of the Middle East, bringing back knowledge of science, medicine, and philosophy that would help fuel the European Renaissance centuries later. In the Islamic world, the Crusades were remembered as invasions and aggressions, shaping collective memory and contributing to a complex relationship with the West that persists in certain ways even today. The Crusades were not solely military endeavors. They were deeply entwined with the social, political, and religious currents of the time. They drew upon the ideals of chivalry and piety, offering a pathway to honor, redemption, and spiritual reward. Yet they were also driven by economic ambition, territorial conquest, and the often ruthless pragmatism of medieval politics. The clash between faith and violence was accompanied by moments of cooperation and coexistence. In some regions, Crusader leaders negotiated alliances with local lords, engaged in trade, and established communities that, at least temporarily, integrated different cultural and religious traditions. These moments, however fleeting, remind us that the Crusades were not monolithic, that the human experience within these wars was as diverse as the people who lived them. By the late 13th century, the Crusader states began to crumble under relentless pressure from Muslim forces. The rise of powerful leaders such as Saladin, who recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, demonstrated the capacity for unity and strategy among Islamic powers in response to the European incursions. The final significant crusade, the Ninth, effectively ended with the loss of the last Christian strongholds in the region, signaling the close of an era defined by centuries of religious warfare, cultural exchange, and political upheaval. Yet the legacy of the Crusades extends far beyond the medieval battlefield. They influenced European identity, notions of holy war, and the development of military orders such as the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers. They left enduring marks on architecture, with fortresses and castles dotting the landscape, and on the imagination, with tales of heroism, piety, and tragedy inspiring chronicles, literature, and legend. The Crusades remind us of the power of belief to shape human action, for better or worse. They demonstrate how ambition, fear, faith, and strategy intertwine, creating outcomes that often surpass the intentions of those involved. And they invite us to consider the human cost of war, the complexity of cultural interaction, and the ways in which history is remembered, interpreted, and repurposed. As the Crusades progressed, the interplay of religion and politics became increasingly intricate. European monarchs saw in these campaigns opportunities to expand their influence, assert authority over rebellious nobles, and consolidate their own power. At the same time, the papacy wielded the Crusades as a tool to project spiritual supremacy, extending its reach into temporal affairs and using the promise of heavenly reward to mobilize armies and resources. The motivations of individual crusaders were equally complex. Some were driven by sincere religious devotion, some by the lure of wealth and land, others by a desire for adventure or recognition. This confluence of faith, ambition, and circumstance set the stage for both extraordinary acts of heroism and unspeakable acts of violence. The Second Crusade, launched in response to the fall of Edessa in 1144, demonstrated the challenges of sustaining momentum and coordination over such a vast geographical theater. European kings, including Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, led their armies into the Levant, only to encounter logistical difficulties, internal dissent, and fierce resistance from Muslim forces. The Crusaders suffered devastating defeats, particularly at the hands of well-organized defenders who utilized knowledge of the terrain and strategic alliances. Despite their failures, the Second Crusade further solidified the concept of a pan-European military effort, a notion that transcended national boundaries and united disparate Christian kingdoms under a common cause. Meanwhile, Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, emerged as one of the most formidable leaders of the era. A man of extraordinary strategic vision and personal charisma, he managed to unite Muslim territories that had long been divided by rivalry and factionalism. His victories culminated in the recapture of Jerusalem in 1187, an event that shocked the Christian world and prompted the launch of the Third Crusade. Saladin's reputation was not merely that of a conqueror. He was admired by both allies and adversaries for his chivalry, generosity, and respect for the rules of warfare, qualities that added a layer of complexity to the enduring narrative of the Crusades. The Third Crusade, often referred to as the King's Crusade, brought some of Europe's most famous monarchs to the Holy Land. Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire each commanded forces with their own distinct strategies, rivalries, and agendas. Frederick's tragic death by drowning in Anatolia set a tone of misfortune, while the ongoing disputes between Richard and Philip highlighted the fragile nature of alliances among European leaders. Despite capturing key cities and achieving significant military victories, the Crusade ultimately failed to recapture Jerusalem. A negotiated settlement with Saladin allowed Christian pilgrims access to holy sites, illustrating the pragmatic diplomacy that often tempered the brutality of war. The subsequent Crusades continued in the shadow of these earlier campaigns, marked by varying degrees of ambition, success, and failure. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, would become infamous not for its battles in the Holy Land, but for the diversion of the crusading army to Constantinople. Economic incentives, political intrigue, and the influence of Venetian merchants led the Crusaders to sack the Byzantine capital in 1204, creating a Latin empire and leaving a legacy of bitterness between Eastern and Western Christendom that would endure for centuries. This event underscored how the Crusades were shaped as much by European politics and economic interests as by religious fervor. Meanwhile, the Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Crusades, spanning the 13th century, witnessed both ambitious plans and tragic miscalculations. Leaders such as Louis IX of France, who would later be canonized as Saint Louis, undertook campaigns driven by religious zeal and a personal sense of duty to Christendom. Yet, despite initial successes in Egypt and other regions, logistical challenges, disease, and resilient local forces often undermined these efforts. The Crusader States, now weakened by internal divisions and external pressure, struggled to maintain their footholds, and the dream of a lasting Christian kingdom in the Holy Land increasingly became a mirage. The broader impact of the Crusades on European society cannot be overstated. The wars stimulated the growth of trade networks, as Italian city-states such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa profited from transporting troops and supplies. These economic developments helped lay the groundwork for the rise of mercantile capitalism and the eventual transition from a feudal economy to a more market-oriented system. Moreover, exposure to the sophisticated cultures of the Islamic world, its medicine, philosophy, mathematics, and art, enriched European intellectual life, seeding ideas that would later flourish during the Renaissance. The Crusades also shaped social structures in Europe. The rise of military orders like the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights reflected a merging of religious devotion and martial discipline. These orders amassed wealth, lands, and influence, acting as both protectors of pilgrims and agents of political power. They established fortifications, managed estates, and even participated in banking and finance, illustrating how the Crusades extended beyond mere military endeavors into broader social, economic, and administrative spheres. In the Islamic world, the Crusades were a period of both trauma and opportunity. While the repeated invasions caused devastation and upheaval, they also prompted military and political innovation. Leaders like Saladin demonstrated the capacity for uniting disparate territories under centralized authority, advancing both strategic and administrative practices. The memory of the Crusades became embedded in cultural narratives, literature, and religious discourse, shaping perceptions of Europe and the West for generations. It is crucial to recognize that the Crusades were not a singular event nor a monolithic experience. They encompassed a wide spectrum of actions, motives, and consequences. Ordinary people, peasants, artisans, merchants, and clerics experienced the Crusades in profoundly different ways than kings and generals. For some, the journey was an opportunity for salvation and adventure. For others, it was a perilous ordeal marked by hunger, disease, and violence. The landscapes they traversed were transformed by warfare, fortifications, and the movement of peoples, leaving scars on both the natural and human environment. Religious ideology permeated every aspect of the crusading era. The notion of fighting in the name of God, of pilgrimage combined with martial endeavor, created a framework in which violence could be sanctified. Yet this religious justification often intersected with practical concerns: control of trade routes, access to resources, and the assertion of political power. This intersection of the spiritual and the temporal was a defining feature of the Crusades, illustrating how human motivations are rarely singular and how the pursuit of divine purpose often coexists with very earthly ambition. Despite the military setbacks and eventual decline of the Crusader States, the Crusades left enduring legacies in law, culture, and diplomacy. European rulers developed more sophisticated administrative structures to support long-distance campaigns. Cities grew in importance as centers of commerce and logistics. Cultural exchange introduced new ideas in science, philosophy, and the arts, challenging prevailing norms and expanding horizons. Even in areas directly affected by the Crusades, local societies adapted to the presence of foreign powers, negotiating alliances and navigating the complex interplay of cultural and religious differences. By the late 13th century, the Crusades had begun to wane. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the end of significant Christian control in the Levant. European interest gradually shifted elsewhere, to the expansion of trade, exploration, and internal political consolidation. Yet the memory of the Crusades persisted, shaping narratives of heroism, martyrdom, and divine favor, while also leaving a legacy of resentment and conflict between Christian and Muslim worlds. The Crusades were not a singular triumph or failure. They were a complex, multifaceted phenomenon, illustrating the power of human ambition, faith, and resilience in the face of extraordinary challenges. Even as the Crusades in the Holy Land came to an end, their influence rippled across Europe and the Mediterranean for centuries. The campaigns had tested the limits of medieval logistics, diplomacy, and military strategy. They had brought together knights and nobles from disparate regions, compelling them to cooperate and compete in ways that reshaped notions of leadership and honor. The experience of warfare abroad also introduced Europeans to new forms of military technology, from fortification techniques to siege engines, which would later inform conflicts closer to home. Trade was perhaps one of the most enduring consequences of the Crusades. Italian city-states such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa had played pivotal roles in transporting crusaders and supplies, profiting enormously in the process. Their commercial networks expanded into the Eastern Mediterranean, fostering the exchange of goods like silk, spices, and precious metals. This burgeoning trade brought wealth and cosmopolitan influences to Europe, challenging the insularity of the feudal system and laying the foundations for the economic transformations of the late Middle Ages. Markets, banking systems, and merchant guilds all benefited from the connections forged during the era of crusading. Cultural exchange was another unexpected byproduct of these conflicts. Crusaders encountered advanced civilizations in the Middle East, learning new approaches to medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. Classical texts preserved by Islamic scholars were rediscovered, translated, and disseminated throughout Europe. The Arabic numerals, medical treatises, and philosophical ideas absorbed during the Crusades helped fuel intellectual currents that would eventually culminate in the Renaissance. In many ways, the Crusades acted as a bridge between worlds, bringing European societies into closer contact with cultures that had long been separated by geography and ideology. Religious orders established during the Crusades also left a lasting mark. The Knights Templar, founded to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, grew into a powerful institution with wealth, political influence, and a complex network of fortifications across Europe and the Levant. The Hospitallers, originally tasked with caring for sick and wounded pilgrims, evolved into a formidable military and political presence. These orders exemplified the blending of piety and power, demonstrating how religious devotion could intersect with temporal authority, often with dramatic consequences. The interaction between crusaders and local populations produced both conflict and cooperation. In cities under Crusader control, European administrators had to govern a diverse population, including Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians. This required negotiation, compromise, and sometimes ruthless enforcement of authority. At the same time, trade and day-to-day interaction fostered cultural exchanges, intermarriage, and the spread of ideas. Though often overshadowed by the violence of battle, these social and economic dynamics were crucial in shaping the medieval Mediterranean world. It is also important to recognize the human cost of the Crusades. Beyond the deaths on the battlefield, thousands suffered from disease, famine, and displacement. The campaigns disrupted local economies and societies, and the legacy of violence had lasting psychological and cultural effects. For many in the Islamic world, the Crusades became symbols of foreign aggression and religious intolerance, shaping historical narratives and collective memory for generations. Conversely, European chronicles often framed the Crusades as sacred missions, emphasizing martyrdom, divine favor, and heroic feats. These divergent perspectives underscore the complexity of historical memory and the ways in which conflict can be remembered differently by different communities. Political ramifications extended beyond the immediate theater of war. In Europe, the Crusades influenced the consolidation of monarchical power and the development of centralized authority. Monarchs who participated in crusades often returned with heightened prestige, having demonstrated piety, courage, and leadership. Noble families leveraged their involvement to enhance status and secure lands or titles. Conversely, the financial burdens of campaigning placed enormous strains on European economies, prompting new forms of taxation, borrowing, and economic organization. These pressures would have long-term implications for the development of European states and the eventual emergence of nation-states. The Crusades also stimulated the evolution of military strategy. European armies learned to operate in extended campaigns far from home, coordinate across diverse contingents, and adapt to unfamiliar terrains and enemy tactics. The fortifications erected during the Crusades, castles, citadels, and walled cities, reflected advances in defensive architecture, influencing European construction for centuries. Siege warfare techniques, logistics for sustaining armies over long distances, and methods of intelligence gathering all evolved in response to the demands of the crusading campaigns. In addition to these tangible impacts, the Crusades had profound effects on ideas and ideology. The notion of a just war and the blending of religious obligation with martial endeavor became deeply embedded in European thought. Pilgrimage and penance were intertwined with military service, shaping concepts of honor, duty, and spiritual merit. These ideas influenced not only subsequent religious conflicts, but also the way Europeans conceptualized their own identity and relation to the broader world. The Crusades were also instrumental in shaping perceptions of the East in European imagination. They introduced Europeans to the cultures, technologies, and economies of the Middle East, but often filtered these encounters through lenses of fear, exoticism, and religious bias. Stories of wealth, advanced scholarship, and urban sophistication were mingled with tales of infidels, danger, and moral corruption. These narratives persisted long after the physical presence of Crusader armies had ended, contributing to enduring stereotypes and shaping cross-cultural interactions in the centuries to come. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the Crusades reinforced the importance of unity in the face of external threat. Leaders like Saladin and his successors understood that survival depended on cooperation across political, ethnic, and sectarian divisions. Military victories, defensive strategies, and diplomatic engagement during this period became central to the maintenance of territorial integrity and political legitimacy. The memory of the Crusades was preserved in chronicles, literature, and folklore, forming an integral part of the historical consciousness of the region. Over time, the Crusades also influenced art, literature, and historiography. European writers chronicled battles, sieges, and heroic deeds, creating narratives that blended fact and legend. These accounts inspired epic poems, romances, and later historical studies, framing the Crusades as moral and spiritual dramas as well as military campaigns. In the Islamic world, historians and poets commemorated leaders like Saladin and the defensive cities, crafting stories that highlighted courage, wisdom, and the complexities of leadership. Through these cultural products, the Crusades became more than historical events. They were woven into the fabric of collective identity, imagination, and cultural memory. The end of the Crusader States did not mark the conclusion of crusading activity. Later campaigns, including expeditions against heretics in Europe and military efforts in the Baltic and North Africa, were influenced by the same ideology that had motivated the Holy Land Crusades. The conceptual framework of holy war, the mobilization of troops in the name of faith, and the intertwining of religious and political objectives persisted, adapting to new contexts and challenges. This enduring legacy demonstrates how deeply the Crusades shaped medieval and early modern European thought. Yet, even as we trace their consequences, it is essential to remember the individual experiences of those who lived through the Crusades. Knights and soldiers confronted the harsh realities of long campaigns, enduring hunger, illness, and the ever-present threat of violence. Pilgrims and clergy navigated dangerous territories, sometimes providing aid, other times caught in the crossfire. Local populations faced displacement, taxation, and the upheaval of traditional social structures. The Crusades were lived history, not merely recorded events, and their impact on human lives was profound and multifaceted. The Crusades also revealed the challenges of cross-cultural contact. Misunderstanding, mistrust, and prejudice often fueled conflict, while moments of cooperation, trade, and diplomacy demonstrated the potential for constructive engagement. These lessons resonate far beyond the medieval period. The Crusades were, in many ways, a crucible in which the dynamics of culture, religion, politics, and war were tested, producing outcomes that were both destructive and generative. As the centuries progressed, the memory of the Crusades became deeply embedded in the political and cultural consciousness of both Europe and the Islamic world. In Europe, the stories of valiant knights, holy missions, and epic battles formed the backbone of chivalric ideals and inspired generations of leaders, writers, and artists. Literature and song romanticize the campaigns, sometimes glossing over the brutality of war to emphasize courage, piety, and honor. These narratives helped shape notions of European identity, linking faith, martial prowess, and moral righteousness in ways that extended far beyond the medieval battlefield. The legacy of military orders also endured long after the Crusader States had disappeared. The Knights Templar, despite their dramatic suppression in the early 14th century, remained legendary figures in European imagination, associated with secret knowledge, treasure, and the defense of the Christian faith. The Hospitallers evolved into the Order of Malta, establishing a lasting presence that bridged Europe and the Mediterranean for centuries. These institutions exemplified the intertwining of religious devotion, martial discipline, and political influence, illustrating how the Crusades had reshaped European structures of power and authority. The Crusades' influence on European governance and legal frameworks should not be underestimated. The necessity of organizing large-scale campaigns, maintaining supply lines, and managing territorial holdings abroad prompted innovations in administration, finance, and diplomacy. Monarchs and nobles alike learned to negotiate complex alliances, administer diverse populations, and project power across considerable distances. These experiences informed the later development of more centralized states, contributing to the gradual decline of feudal fragmentation and laying the groundwork for modern European governance. The impact of the Crusades was also evident in art and architecture. Fortresses, castles, and city walls erected during this period reflected advances in military engineering and strategic thinking. Gothic cathedrals, illuminated manuscripts, and religious iconography were influenced by cross-cultural encounters, incorporating motifs, techniques, and materials from the Islamic world. Decorative arts, textiles, and architectural elements traveled along trade routes established or expanded during the Crusades, leaving tangible traces of intercultural exchange that enriched European aesthetics and craftsmanship. Religiously, the Crusades deepened the influence of the Catholic Church while also exposing tensions within Christendom. Popes sought to assert authority over kings and nobles, using crusades as instruments to enforce spiritual and political objectives. Yet, the divergent motivations and occasional failures of crusading efforts revealed the limits of papal influence and underscored the complexity of balancing religious ideals with practical realities. Moreover, the involvement of different Christian denominations, Eastern Orthodox, Latin Catholics, and local Eastern Christians, highlighted the fragmentation and diversity within Christendom itself, influencing ecclesiastical politics for generations. The Crusades' consequences extended to the Jewish populations of Europe and the Near East. Jewish communities often suffered violence during crusading expeditions, particularly during early campaigns when mobs of zealots passed through European towns en route to the Holy Land. These persecutions foreshadowed later patterns of anti-Jewish violence and shaped communal memory. At the same time, Jewish merchants, scholars, and diplomats sometimes facilitated communication, trade, and negotiation between cultures, illustrating the complex interplay of vulnerability and agency that characterized their experiences. In the Islamic world, the Crusades reinforced the necessity of strategic unity and adaptation. Leaders such as Saladin, Nur ad-Din, and their successors combined military prowess with diplomacy to resist European incursions. The campaigns fostered advances in fortification design, battlefield tactics, and administrative coordination. The Crusades also stimulated intellectual reflection, producing histories, chronicles, and theological discussions that sought to explain the causes of the invasions and offer lessons for governance, religion, and social cohesion. The memory of the Crusades became a powerful cultural touchstone, influencing literature, religious thought, and political ideology. The long-term economic impact of the Crusades was multifaceted. While some regions were devastated by warfare, others experienced growth through trade, finance, and resource management. Italian merchants, in particular, capitalized on the movement of goods and people, establishing networks that connected Europe with the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and beyond. These commercial activities facilitated the spread of ideas, technologies, and cultural products, contributing to a period of economic transformation that would later support exploration, urbanization, and the early stages of globalization. The Crusades also reshaped notions of warfare itself. The blending of religious zeal, professional soldiers, and feudal levies created new forms of military organization. Command structures evolved to accommodate coalition armies drawn from multiple regions, and logistical systems were developed to sustain long campaigns in hostile territories. Naval power became increasingly important, with fleets transporting troops, supplies, and equipment across the Mediterranean. These innovations had lasting influence on European military thought, informing later conflicts in both continental and overseas theaters. Socially, the Crusades altered the mobility and aspirations of individuals. Peasants, knights, and merchants alike were offered opportunities for travel, wealth, and social advancement. The idea that service in a holy war could grant spiritual and temporal rewards motivated many to embark on journeys that would have been unimaginable in a more localized feudal context. These experiences broadened horizons, exposed individuals to new ideas, and fostered networks of contact that would influence European society for generations. Culturally, the Crusades facilitated the transmission of knowledge. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy from the Islamic world were introduced to Europe, sometimes through translations of Arabic texts into Latin. Scholars encountered advanced medical practices, algebraic concepts, and philosophical treatises that challenged prevailing European thought. The infusion of this knowledge contributed to the intellectual ferment that would later characterize the Renaissance, demonstrating that even in the context of conflict, human societies are capable of exchanging ideas, techniques, and cultural insights. The Crusades also produced enduring myths and legends. Tales of heroism, betrayal, and miraculous interventions were chronicled in both Christian and Muslim sources, blending fact and fiction. These stories shaped perceptions of the other, constructed narratives of moral and spiritual struggle, and provided models of conduct, courage, and piety. They also reinforced collective memory, ensuring that the events of the Crusades would continue to influence religious, cultural, and political discourse long after the last banners had fallen from the Holy Land. Religious devotion remained a driving force throughout the crusading era. Pilgrimage, penitence, and the pursuit of spiritual merit were intertwined with military service, creating a unique form of religious experience. The idea that fighting in defense of the faith could atone for sins and bring divine favor was deeply motivating for many. At the same time, this ideology could justify extreme acts of violence, leading to moral dilemmas that resonate in historical analysis to this day. The Crusades thus illustrate the powerful, sometimes perilous, intersection of belief, action, and consequence. Even as the military campaigns waned, the memory of the Crusades continued to shape diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange. European powers remained engaged with the Eastern Mediterranean through commerce, negotiation, and occasional military intervention. Islamic societies maintained vigilance against potential incursions and reflected on lessons learned from past conflicts. The interactions between cultures during the Crusades, sometimes violent, sometimes cooperative, laid the groundwork for centuries of contact, exchange, and mutual influence. The decline of the Crusader States did not erase their legacy. Fortifications, settlements, and legal structures endured in various forms, influencing local society and subsequent territorial administration. Military orders adapted to new contexts, continuing to exercise influence across Europe and the Mediterranean. Knowledge, art, and cultural practices exchanged during the Crusades persisted, contributing to Europe's evolving intellectual, social, and artistic landscape. In essence, while the direct objectives of the Crusades, permanent Christian control of the Holy Land, were not achieved, their broader impact on the world was profound, multifaceted, and enduring. As the Crusades drew to a close in the late 13th century, Europe and the Middle East entered a period of reflection, consolidation, and transformation. The territories once held by European crusaders in the Levant had been reclaimed by local powers. Yet, the experience of these centuries of conflict left an indelible mark on both sides of the Mediterranean. Political structures, trade networks, cultural exchanges, and social norms had all been shaped in response to the challenges and opportunities presented by the crusading era. The lessons of these campaigns continued to inform military strategy, diplomacy, and governance long after the last fortress had fallen. One of the most enduring legacies of the Crusades was the concept of mobilizing society for a religiously sanctioned cause. The notion that ordinary citizens, soldiers, and nobles could be united under a common spiritual and political objective had profound implications for European society. It fostered a sense of shared identity, collective responsibility, and moral purpose that transcended regional, linguistic, and feudal boundaries. The ideal of holy war, though complex and morally fraught, became embedded in European consciousness, influencing future conflicts and shaping notions of righteous struggle. Trade, enriched and expanded by the movement of crusaders and the demand for supplies, continued to flourish. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Marseille developed extensive commercial networks that connected Europe to the Levant, North Africa, and beyond. These networks not only facilitated the exchange of goods, but also of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The Crusades thus acted as a catalyst for early globalization, creating channels through which knowledge, art, and scientific understanding could travel across continents. Spices, textiles, and luxury items introduced Europeans to new tastes and aesthetics, while intellectual imports in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine seeded innovations that would flourish in later centuries. The social impact of the Crusades was equally profound. The campaigns provided unprecedented mobility for individuals, allowing peasants, merchants, and artisans to travel far beyond their homelands. These journeys offered opportunities for economic advancement, social recognition, and personal fulfillment. Knights and nobles could gain prestige and wealth, while clergy and pilgrims sought spiritual reward. The interaction among diverse groups, European, Byzantine, Muslim, Jewish, and local Christian populations, created a dynamic, often tense environment in which new forms of cultural negotiation and adaptation were necessary. The Crusades also left a legacy of religious, cultural, and intellectual exchange. Contact with the Islamic world introduced Europeans to advanced knowledge in science, philosophy, and medicine. Classical texts preserved by Muslim scholars were translated into Latin, enriching European intellectual traditions and challenging established modes of thought. Mathematics, astronomy, and medical treatises informed the curricula of universities and the development of scholarly inquiry, laying a foundation for the Renaissance. Artistic and architectural influences, including decorative motifs and construction techniques, found their way into European practice, leaving tangible evidence of cross-cultural interaction. However, the Crusades were not without moral and humanitarian cost. Massacres, forced conversions, and the destruction of cities left deep scars on populations. European Jews, Muslims, and Eastern Christians often became targets of violence, while armies endured extreme hardship, disease, and death. The human toll of these campaigns reminds us that even in the pursuit of religious or ideological objectives, the consequences for ordinary people are profound and often tragic. Historical memory of these events remains complex, with differing perspectives emphasizing heroism, martyrdom, oppression, or victimization, depending on the cultural lens through which they are viewed. In the political sphere, the Crusades influenced the development of European states. Monarchs who led expeditions often returned with enhanced authority and prestige, consolidating power over their territories. Military orders and noble families accrued lands and influence, reshaping local governance. The experience of long-distance campaigns necessitated innovations in logistics, taxation, and administration, fostering more sophisticated forms of political organization. These developments contributed to the gradual emergence of centralized state structures, setting the stage for the nation-states of the later medieval and early modern periods. The memory of the Crusades also shaped the Islamic world's political, cultural, and intellectual landscape. Leaders like Saladin became enduring symbols of resistance, unity, and moral authority. Military and administrative innovations strengthened states and inspired subsequent generations of rulers. Chronicles, poetry, and legal writings reflected on the experience of defending territories against foreign incursions, providing lessons on leadership, strategy, and governance. The Crusades became part of a broader narrative of historical consciousness, influencing how societies interpreted external threats and internal cohesion. Religiously, the Crusades reinforced both unity and division. While they temporarily united European Christendom under a common banner, they also revealed deep fractures within Christian communities. Tensions between Latin and Eastern Orthodox Christians were exacerbated, as seen in the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople. Differences in practice, theology, and ritual created friction even as soldiers fought under the same cause. In the Islamic world, the Crusades highlighted the importance of religious legitimacy, leadership, and community cohesion in sustaining political and military efforts. Both regions were shaped profoundly by these interlocking religious, political, and cultural dynamics. Culturally, the Crusades enriched European knowledge and artistic practice. Exposure to Eastern architecture, textiles, art, and philosophy broadened European perspectives, while the translation of Arabic scientific and philosophical texts introduced new methods of reasoning and inquiry. Ideas about mathematics, navigation, and astronomy spread across Europe, influencing education, scholarship, and innovation. Even trade goods, spices, silks, precious metals brought new tastes, styles, and economic opportunities, further intertwining the fates of distant regions. The enduring myths and legends of the Crusades continued to influence literature, theater, and public imagination. Tales of knights, saints, and battles against overwhelming odds inspired narratives that blended historical events with moral, spiritual, and romanticized interpretation. These stories provided models of courage, loyalty, and piety, reinforcing social and religious values while shaping collective memory. In the Islamic world, similar narratives honored leaders, chronicled victories, and reflected on the resilience and ingenuity of communities in the face of foreign invasions. The Crusades also offer lessons about the interplay between ideology, ambition, and human agency. They illustrate how belief, when intertwined with political and economic objectives, can drive vast movements of people and resources. They demonstrate the complexity of human motivation, showing how devotion, greed, pragmatism, and courage coexist in shaping decisions and outcomes. The Crusades remind us that historical events are never linear or simple. They are the product of countless individual choices, systemic pressures, and cultural frameworks. Today, the Crusades are remembered in diverse ways. In Europe, they are often studied as historical phenomenon that shaped medieval society, religious thought, and cross-cultural encounters. In the Middle East, they are remembered as episodes of foreign aggression and resistance, influencing collective memory and identity. Across the world, scholars, artists, and educators continue to explore the Crusades, seeking to understand the human experiences, motivations, and consequences embedded within these centuries-long campaigns. By examining these events in all their complexity, we gain insight into the enduring power of faith, ambition, and cultural exchange. The Crusades were more than a series of wars. They were a transformative period that shaped the trajectory of civilizations. They left legacies in governance, commerce, knowledge, art, and culture that resonated long after the last sword had been sheathed. They revealed the potential for cooperation and conflict in human societies, and illustrated the profound consequences of mobilizing people under shared ideals, whether religious, political, or social. In studying the Crusades, we encounter both the heights of human aspiration and the depths of human suffering, gaining a nuanced perspective on the forces that shape history. In reflecting on the Crusades, we are reminded that history is never simply a record of events. It is a tapestry woven from countless human experiences, decisions, and consequences. The victories, defeats, and enduring influences of the Crusades invite us to consider the ways in which culture, religion, politics, and economics intersect, shaping the course of societies over generations. They challenge us to look beyond the surface of historical narratives, to question assumptions, and to seek the deeper currents that drive human action and societal transformation. The story of the Crusades, with all its complexity, tragedy, and triumph, continues to captivate and educate. It invites reflection on the nature of faith and power, the consequences of conflict, and the enduring possibilities of cultural exchange. By exploring these untold dimensions, we gain insight not only into the medieval world, but also into the enduring patterns of human behavior and the interconnections that shape our global history. Thanks for watching The Other Side Stories. If you enjoyed this journey through history's hidden paths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow explorers. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Until next time, keep wondering about the past that shapes our future.